Who is the most powerful person in your family? Again, who is the most powerful person in your family? Some of you just pointed to your spouse. None of you pointed to yourself, though, so we're okay. In my family, I would argue that the most powerful person is not a person, but in fact, our dog, Miri, is the most powerful one in the family. Right? Miri, if we define power as the ability to get what you want, the dog gets what the dog wants. Food, the magic elixir of canine life, peanut butter, somebody to clean up after all of your messes, and rent-free, climate-controlled safety, right? So the dog, if we were to measure power by the ability to get what we want even when we want it, I think we might again have to argue the dog has the most power in the house. I don't want to reflect with you today too much really on dogs. I really want to focus on power, though, and how power works. And I think for most of us in our society, in our world today, we think of power as the ability to get what you want when you want it. So this can look like maybe at a young age, you're the kid who, if you don't like somebody, by the end of recess, you can make sure that nobody else likes that kid. Or maybe you're the one at the office or in your wing of the retirement community, that your ideas are always the one that bubble up, right? That's power. Or maybe power is that person who, even though every single zoning ordinance would have forbidden that construction, somehow they got it approved. Or they're able to use their money to buy them or a special interest. Powers through the political means where they can benefit their family or their businesses. Again, when we think of power, we often think of the ability to do what you want to do, to buy what you want to buy, to say what you want to say, to get done, to get what you want. In many ways, this is the power that ancient Rome and the Roman Empire knew. They were able to get what they wanted. Rome was good at getting it done. And one of the most powerful displays that Rome would have were its imperial parades. And this would happen if there was a victory, or just even if a poobah was coming into town. All the soldiers had to shine their armor. They would line the streets, and they would actually get out palm branches. And in would come the Roman officials, typically led by chariots or even on horses themselves, regal, battle-tested horses that were meant to intimidate and say, we have power. And for the people that had to go to these parades, it was so bitter, like the first century Jews, because as they had to go, right? They had to stand there. And they knew that it was their tax money, which had been extorted from them, that was paying for these parades. And that they had to stand there. And they all had to say, Hail Caesar, or suffer the consequences. Again, Rome had limits on its power, but Rome was able to get it done. And the parades of old were this humbling display of Roman power. Today we hear that when the disciples gather, they're moved because of the deeds of power that they had seen Jesus do. Again, they're moved by the deeds of power that they had witnessed Jesus do. Is this the kind of power we're talking about? Does Jesus have the power where he's able to get whatever he wants, put through politically whatever his agenda is, always have his way? Seems a little bit like a misunderstanding of the power that's talked about in the Gospels. And I'd offer that for Jesus, power is about something else. You could say that Rome has horsepower, but Jesus has a different kind of power, and we might call it donkey power. For Jesus organizes a parade, And he rides on a donkey, and in part he rides on a donkey because he wants to fulfill the ancient prophecies about the Messiah entering into Jerusalem. But it's also because he wants to embody and to proclaim a message about how power is tied to humility, how power is tied to serving others, how power is tied to love. Power in the eyes of Jesus is not the ability to get what you want. Power in the eyes of Jesus is the ability to help other people. And we're going to see kind of how that plays itself out a little bit here. But before I go too much further, I want to admit that I don't want to push the horse and donkey thing too far. First of all, donkeys are really stubborn. Right, so I don't know if any of you, yay, donkeys. Like, well, okay. Also, horses are really majestic animals who are able to be very gracious and can even help people who are sort of struggling with anxiety. So I don't want to sort of make horses bad and donkeys good or anything like that. I mean, any metaphor, you push it too hard and it's going to break. But the other thing is that Jesus had horsepower. Again, Jesus had horsepower. Jesus could get what Jesus wanted. And this is what Jesus does today with the donkey. He says, disciples, I want you to go into the village, and I want you to get that donkey. And like that, it happens. And in some ways, this isn't really a surprise to the ancient world. This is how the divine worked. We heard today from Paul's letter to the Philippians. And what we heard there may not have actually been written by Paul. Although Paul wrote it in the letter of Philippians, it may actually have been something that was used in Christian worship. Again, the way it sort of reads in Greek, it's really poetic, and there's a sense that Paul may actually just have been taking a litany or part of a worship service that the Christians were saying at that time. And it begins, although he was in the form of a God, he did not view that as something to be exploited, but instead chose to become and take on human form, emptying himself, taking on the form of a servant. In other words, Jesus was found in the form of a God. And in the ancient world, you take any one of them, Zeus, Jupiter, Ares, Mars, Venus, Neptune, whatever, and they all have a special power. And what they can do with that special power is they can use it to get what they want. This is what it meant to be a god in the ancient world. You had more power than others, so you could get what you wanted. And again, Jesus in some ways fits the bill here, that he's able to do whatever he wants to do, it seems. Yet Jesus isn't like these ancient Greek gods. Because again, Jesus chooses to take on human form, even emptying himself, taking the form of a slave. And what shows kind of how this works then is that Jesus, at the point we heard in our story, is at the height of his power. Jesus is at the height of his power. The people have come out, and the people are hungry for a Messiah, and they've heard about the miracles that Jesus has done. They want to rise up. They're so ready to pour out into the streets, to protest and to say, "Blessed is the true King." Jerusalem is a tinderbox, and all Jesus would have to do is to snap, and people would go get their weapons. And for an hour, a day, a week, a year, they would regain Jerusalem. But Jesus instead uses this power that he has. And he doesn't do it for something that's just about himself. He does it for the sake of others. And he goes into the temple right after this. And in the temple, he turns over the money changers, because the money changers had set up this sham system that robbed the poor, denied them of their access to sacrifices and forgiveness from God. Jesus takes the power that he has, his horsepower, and turns it into donkey power. He does this act that is on behalf of other people. And this is ultimately the act that's going to get him in so much trouble. It's really, from this point on, you can see that now they want to crucify him, to finally get rid of him. Jesus seals his death warrant, but he does so because he, again, uses what he has for the sake of others. In other words, for Jesus, it's not so much sort of horse versus donkey, but he puts them together. And Jesus embodies what it means to be a servant leader. Jesus is a leader. He has skills and talents. Talents and skills that none of us as humans, in fact, have ever had. But he's also a servant, one who comes to wash the feet, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked. Again, Jesus has come to use what he has for the sake of others. And Jesus does this ultimately. Jesus ultimately goes to the cross that we who would be his followers, would understand and think differently about power, that we too could become servant leaders. Now, I want to be careful here because when I start talking about leaders, a lot of people in their mind say, well, I'm not a leader. Other people are leaders, I'm not a leader. When it comes, though, to how we think about power, all of us have some horsepower that can be converted into donkey power. And maybe that, for example, is a grandmother who has the gift of time. And she just listens to her grandchild pour out their heart about whatever issue is going on. And the grandmother in that voice that has lived through more than one wave and more than one storm just patiently listens and tells the child they will be okay. And the grandchild says, I'll be okay. It's going to be okay. Or it's the person who just hangs out a little bit after school to do some tutoring for the person in need. It's all sorts of little tasks. Little tasks, just like that task to go get that donkey, that don't seem that special, but they're the humble servant way that Jesus calls us to be. This week, I heard a really powerful story of servant leadership, and I want to share it with you. Now, it turns out that many of you have probably heard of a Secret Santa, but it turns out there is an official Secret Santa society. I didn't realize there was an official society, but there's an official society. And it has a really beautiful genesis. Its origin story is really cool. And what happened is that there was this guy who was really down and out on his luck, just struggling. And he goes to a restaurant and he orders a meal, and afterwards he opens up his wallet and he realizes he doesn't have enough money to pay for lunch. He's really embarrassed. So he decides to make a scene and kind of pretend that he's lost a $20 bill on the floor. So he gets down and he starts looking for a 20. Oh, I had a 20, I just can't find it. Kind of cover up for the fact that he doesn't have it. Well, the cook comes out of the kitchen. And the cook gets down on his hands and knees and begins to look for it too. And the guy feels so bad now that he's, has this cook out there looking. And the cook, though, knows what's going on. And the cook finds a 20 and says, oh, this is the 20 you were looking for. The meal is paid for. That person just needed that one break, that one affirmation, that one time that they were seen. Again, it wasn't a huge thing, but it was somebody hearing that call to exercise donkey power, to do the humble and small thing that Christ had set ahead of them. And they went out and they, on their hands and knees, gave somebody a 20. Turned out that guy who was given that $20 that day would end up giving away over $1 million over his lifetime. Again, you just don't ever know. You don't ever know what Christ has called us to. Now, at this point, I could probably kind of stop the sermon there. But you might say, Pastor, what might be the good news then? Well, I'd say, well, first of all, let's just kind of make sure we understand the challenge here. The challenge is that our life isn't going to be measured by how much we can get. Our challenge is that life is going to be measured by how much love we shared and how we helped other people. And what are the ways in which we were obedient to the call of God to get that donkey, to do that humble act of service that Christ had called us to. But what does, again, that leave for the good news? Is the good news that somehow we can't do this? That, in fact, even on this other yardstick, we're going to fall short? Well, I think that is part of the good news, and that's something that we have to wrestle with this week. This whole week of Holy Week is a week in which we're finally forced to confront the limits of humanity and the limits of ourselves as the crowd that was chanting Hosanna becomes the crowd that chants Crucify. Again, there is something this week where we have to wrestle with our shortcomings as humans and hear the good news of Jesus Christ and his willing to take the form of a slave, being obedient even to death on a cross for us. But I think there's something else here. And I think part of what Palm Sunday is about is a reminder that the way the world works, the way the world seems to always have worked and always will work, where power is the ability to get what you want, and so often we see these people with power, even ourselves, abuse what they have for their own ends. That the story today is a reminder that that's finally not how God intends the world to work. And there's a different kind of power, a kind of power that Rome couldn't defeat. And that's the beautiful thing about this cross and this resurrection. The cross and resurrection is the historical witness that the power to insert your will over other people, the power to control, the power to just get and get and get, is not the power that wins. And that power could not defeat the power of Jesus Christ, the power of service, the power of love, and the power of humility. And so today I think is a day to celebrate that there is another way that the power works. As I looked outside today and I saw a bunch of older kids collecting eggs. But they weren't collecting eggs for themselves. They were helping to clean up. Again, this is a different way of thinking about how we use what we have. And so that way, when we say today in the Lord's Prayer, the kingdom and the power and the glory are yours, we know that we're not talking about the power of Rome. We're talking about the power of Christ and the power of the cross. And for that reason, when Jesus comes, we say, "Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord." Amen.